That would be good.
Yeah, I'm Alexis's uncle. For those of you who don't know, it's gay uncle. But we're just gonna get started.
Sure, let's just go.
All right.
Don't think presentation, think more conversation.
Sure. So, born and raised here in Phoenix, specifically South Phoenix. Does anyone know where South Phoenix is? Anyone heard of South Phoenix? Cool. It's an important part of town to know about because it's the formerly segregated part of town, which I did not know growing up. But what that meant was I grew up with a lot of black and brown kids. That's mainly who I grew up with because that's mainly who's there. I learned later, right, because the reason you have such a high concentration there is because that's where families could live. And they weren't allowed to live in other places. And so my family goes back 4 generations is what I can track. I'm sure we go back further than that, but I can't track it because I think it gets into our indigenous ancestry, which I don't really know about. And so, you know, when you, in a place like South Phoenix, we weren't the only family that had these types of really deep roots. And as I got older, I remember reading this article and it was like, Phoenix, an ocean of strangers. And it was like, they were talking about how all these neighborhoods were really disconnected even internally to each other. People didn't really know each other even if they were neighbors. And how that's kind of like a staple of the county, right? Of Phoenix being this like rapidly growing city where everyone moves here because it's cheap and whatever, but no one really knows each other. And I remember reading that article and being like, that's not South Phoenix in the same way. Because South Phoenix actually is one of those places that really does have deep roots where like, you know, I remember like my mom can go literally to any grocery store and know 10 people. And they will all say hi to her and she'll ask about their kids and so on and so forth. And so, you know, I'm recognizing that part of the reason that that is true is because again, when you're poor, you gotta like rely on each other. And that's just part of the narrative of the story of South Phoenix and that community that in a lot of ways was born out of this racial tension, was born out of a class tension, was born out of social economic tension. Where literally the rest of the city was prospering and building itself off of the health and the well-being of people in South Phoenix. And so I think about that as well, like what does that mean? Right, like, because I grew up realizing, well, one, I grew up 2 ways. When I was younger, I grew up knowing that South Phoenix was the ghetto, because everyone told me. I grew up knowing that South Phoenix was the ghetto and Maryville was the Barrio ghetto, right, because that was the difference. And these were all the stories that people told me about where I lived. But as I got older, I realized like, oh, South Phoenix was the home of all the farm workers. Like my mom and dad, right? And their mom and dad, right? Because if you were exploited work, like a lot of Mexicans were, you also didn't get choices of where you lived. You had to live in places like South Phoenix or West Phoenix. And so it's also the place where there's like 7 industrial waste sites out of the like 10 that the county has. Let me say this again. There's 7 industrial waste sites out of the 10 that serve the entire county's waste, all in one spot of South Phoenix. All of the asphalt it takes to build the roads, right? Because we're like such a car culture. Well, we have multiple asphalt production all along South Phoenix. It borders, right? So if you go from regular Phoenix into South Phoenix, you're gonna have to pass through these dump sites. You're gonna have to pass through these industrial waste sites. You're gonna have to pass through these sites where they make concrete, where they make asphalt. You could smell it in the air. And it's all of these things, the chemical dipping, right? Like we live, so the airport is really important to us. My brother worked as a chemical dipper. So if you have anyone that has family that works off of like Buckeye and 51st Avenue, in one of those really big nondescript buildings, if you know the area, airplane parts have to be dumped into chemicals military parts have to be dumped into chemicals. And all along the Rio Salado, which is the border between South Phoenix and regular Phoenix, we have all of these industries that we make a lot of money off of as a county, as a city, as a state. And people like my brother and a lot of folks, right, that didn't have access to education, that didn't have access to a lot of things, but need to work, find themselves doing chemical dipping, right? All of these things are in this one area of South Phoenix. And another thing people always told me about South Phoenix is how, we're always sick. Every major public health issue is twice or 3 times the rate in South Phoenix. So diabetes, heart disease, respiratory illness, different types of cancers. All of these come together because South Phoenix is also an area where you die 14 years earlier than other parts of the city. And so you can look at what is the average life expectancy of a zip code. And today, the zip code 85040, where South Phoenix is and which houses these dump sites, this area that I'm talking about, which is right next to a bunch of homes, right, neighborhoods that people lived at, like our family. That zip code has a 14-year less life expectancy than Paradise Valley. 14-year life expectancy difference. Why? Because it's all of the industry, all of the dirty stuff that we as a city, as a county, have to deal with as a modern city. But only one part of the city deals with it in a way that no other part of the city deals with it. No other part of the county deals with it. And that's part of when I started to learn about environmental racism, right, and what that meant, is because that is what South Phoenix is, again. It's the formerly segregated part of town. It is the town where the city itself, mainly white Phoenix at the time, said this is where we're gonna put all of our dumping. As it progressed and we made into the Industrial Revolution, we continued to say this is where we're gonna put and dump our stuff. And that has shaped people like myself and families that come from this area to a point where, of course, we're gonna become organizers. Of course, we're gonna learn these things and ask questions and start to figure this stuff out. And so that brings me to where I'm at right now. So I've been a community organizer for about 15 years. I mainly worked with labor. I mainly worked with construction workers is how I got started into organizing. And that's because all my uncles worked at construction, because that is, right, you follow whatever the industry is that makes the money, right? So we're like a construction economy, right? We're built off of houses and the ability to build and sell houses. So construction is really important. So anytime that is the driving industry, that's where exploitation is always gonna be happening, right? Because that's where you're making the money. And you gotta follow the money. And so when I got into worker organizing, I started as a union organizer with construction workers, talking about safety, talking about people not getting paid, right? Wage theft. We worked with a lot of undocumented workers because, again, that's how exploitation also happens, the cheap labor. We had a lot of workers who were not allowed, right? Didn't feel like they could talk about their safety issues because they would have the fear of deportation, which they saw other people happen to them, right? The boss would literally just call ICE to handle their worker problem using our government tax dollars, right? To basically exploit workers. So those are the type of fights that I worked on. And then I became a political organizer and worked on a lot of campaigns for Phoenix City Council. And so I have a lot of access to new council members that currently sit there asking these new questions. And right now I am working on an organizing project around the light rail expansion, specifically around gentrification and displacement. What happens when large-scale investment projects decide to revitalize the formerly neglected, formerly, segregated part of town? what seems to be happening is that the people who live there no longer are able to stay there. And so that's the current project that I'm working on right now. But all of those things kind of shaped why I do what I do and the work that I choose to do, the community organizing world that I'm in. And a lot of that comes to how I understand diversity as well. And so I now, last thing I do is I started a small consulting firm with 4 other folks. We mainly work with larger institutions around issues of racial equity. And what that actually means for us is helping institutions understand what are your problems, right? Especially when it comes to your ability to share power with people who you're trying to help, quote unquote, instead of partner with. And so, yeah, I guess that's my quick rundown.
Okay, that's really good. That's really good.
All right.
So now we're going to actually want to know about Joseph personally, right? So we're going to ask about your upbringing,
Sure.
your worldview, those kind of things. And we already got a little idea of where you ended up, but now we want to understand the elements of what did. So everybody has their questions ready? Do we want to just open it up, or do you want to go table by table? All right, we'll open it up, and then you guys can just go. So first question for Joseph. Think about what you want to know about a person you just met when you think in terms of the stories that they lead their life with.
How do you think South Phoenix shaped you as a person?
How do I think you shape me as a person? I was so hurt people. And South Phoenix has a lot of hurt people, right? Because it's like an intersection of a lot of traumas. And I didn't understand that till a lot later, right? But I knew I was gay very young. And I grew up in a Catholic school with a lot of machismo. Does anyone know what machismo is? So like in like Latin culture, it's like this, it's toxic masculinity is really what it is, right? But that's a nice cultural word, right? A euphemistic word. But anyway, grew up with a lot of toxic masculinity that we called machismo, right? Which made me be a very quiet, shy, and uncertain student and kid. And it wasn't until after I got out of high school and found myself in college. Actually, that's a lot of where I started to tap into that part of me that I felt I always had to hide. And it's helped inform like, oh, that comes from a lot of really angry, hurting men with little opportunity, right? Like my brother was a big time gangbanger in the 90s. Very, very machismo. Became, found his calling when he went to the military and found purpose. And so it was just interesting because I think that's been a big part of my shaping because I wear my identity very, very much so now, right? And I'm fine with it, but realizing that that's a big part of it, that there's a lot of LGBTQ kids of color in South Phoenix that feel like they have to leave South Phoenix to find themselves. And then slowly make their way back, because it's like, oh, we're all hurting for different reasons. So that's been a part of how South Phoenix is shaping in one of many ways.
Do you think Phoenix has improved on their, especially in LGBTQ spaces?
I mean, yeah, I think there's been an improvement in some ways, but not without fight. I've never seen any improvement without some kind of fight, without some kind of clawing tooth and nail to get what you deserve. There's no improvement that happens culturally for marginalized peoples of any identity that doesn't happen without that. And so there's been improvement, and it's cost a lot.
going table by table or?
No, just shout, when you wanna know something, right, curiosity-led questioning.
Okay, what gender roles were emphasized in your family? How did you respond to them?
Male gender roles, right? Like, so both of my grandfathers were military men. And that is a very real prominent thing. Where now most of my cousins are male cousins have gone into the military as well. And there's a certain status, even internally with family, for military people. And there is a certain way of being, right? Of like very control through dominance. There's also this weird affinity for Americana that happens with military families, like red, white, and blue. And I have a number of family members that have like the American flag tattooed somewhere on their body, which is awesome. But I find that it comes very much from this military background, and being, you know, the gay kid in my immediate family of all boys. There's just these things that my brothers tend to just accept, and things that I very much questioned, and they were very much because of this male expression of what was right, what was wrong, how you're supposed to be, what a real man is. I heard my dad say this literally just the other day. We were out for his birthday at Williams, Arizona, picking pumpkins, and there's my niece and my nephew, and we're sitting, my dad, and I don't even remember why he said it, but he was like, real men, whatever. And again, it's like a lot of those male gender roles were definitely informed, taught to our family by the military. And they have changed in our own ways, and we use our own language about them, but if I go to what my dad is really saying when he says real men are this, real men are that, where did he learn that from? He learned it from this military lineage. That I know. And so it usually puts a lot of conflict with me and some of the men in my family. We've gotten better at it. We've gotten better at having these conversations, but these are definitely conversations I am demanding to have now, if people want to be in my family.
Don't be shy. Does everybody have 2 questions ready? So, yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Have 2, that way if nobody's speaking up, I might call on you.
Okay, discuss your values. Who or what influenced the development of your values?
Discuss my values. I can discuss one. So I've always blurred the line between professional and personal, as most community organizers do. Like, it's really hard to separate that, like most 9-to-5ers do, because my work is personal. And so professionally, personally, I'm guided. So good organizers at least should be guided by a very strict, clear set of values that are imbued in all of their work. And so for me, what's shaping most of my work right now today is intersectional Black feminism, and every value set that comes with, which I am a relatively new practitioner of, but as I read and as I do my homework about what guides those value sets, things like how do you embody generosity? How do you seek to solve conflict through grace? Like, these are not easy values to live by at all, especially when your source of conflict is so violent towards you. And so there's a lot of wisdom in intersectional Black feminism that I'm just in love with. It's also where the most profound queer writing is, because most intersectional Black feminists were also queer. So think of like Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, Gloria Anzaldúa. These are all women that like wore their queerness. They're like, I'm a queer, like totally poet, warrior, and they would name these identities because they were like, I am going to not invisibilize any part of myself. I'm not just Black. I am all of these things. I'm not just a woman. I'm all of these things. And I find that especially as a queer organizer here locally, so informative of what we need to be doing and embodying if we're going to build a movement that will break us free of some of the craziness that we see in this state. So.
Those are the values that you've learned through time. Can
Sure.
you recall what your values were either as a family or yourself when you were young growing up? Like what were the core things that you prioritized?
I mean, growing up, family, right? Because again, South Phoenix is full of families that live relatively close to each other. My mom and my cousins, we're all like 5 minutes away from each other. And so family celebration became really key and central. And I think that's probably the baseline of which I had to learn certain values. It's also the baseline by which I'm like, oh, there's the things that I have to unlearn. Because that's part of that. That's definitely my foundation of what shaped me was family first, family, and then church. Right? Because I grew up Catholic, and all my family's Catholic as well. And so if family and Catholicism were my baseline values that taught and shaped me as a young person, then as an adult where I was able to have my full agency, those are also the places I went back to figure out, well, what was I going to keep and what am I not going to keep anymore? But those were my grounding, family and church. Do you have a question?
Is church something you still value, is it something still big in your
Church? Church? That's a difficult one. No. I don't value it in the same way. I actually find church spaces pretty problematic, if I'm being really honest. And that's most church spaces I go to. There's very few church spaces I don't find to be problematic in some way, shape, or form. That being said, Catholicism in particular, I think there's some of its deepest teachings that I still can't let go of. But I'm looking at it very differently now. Actually, I would say that a lot of my religious teachings, like when I think of Easter, right, is like a big one. I'm refinding and reconstituting in a lot of ways as I reconnect with indigeneity, if that makes sense. And I find more of the spiritual sense of the things that I still hold important, especially things that I got right, like engaging with the divine, right? That's like Eucharism, that's Eucharist, right? In for Catholics, when you take the host, or like when you go pray in front of the tabernacle, right? You're engaging with the divine, like that's still very important to me to do, just not in those practices, right? I'd rather do that in a very different way. But I can't deny that that's still important to me, So I don't know if that answers your question.
It seems that there's struggles with stories within the church that I'm hearing, is that you said the spaces are problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Can you expand that? Because we talked about, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Yuval Harari, the historian that talks about the myths we use to survive as humans. We tell stories. So that's how we started this class, is the basis of individuals have stories that they hold on to, but those stories don't ultimately mean truth for everybody.
Right.
So what are your stories within religion that kind of made you struggle and find your own path?
So, you know, I think the first time I ever questioned religion was seeing my mom question it. And so, right, so like we're taught to respect our elders, respect, especially men of authority. Priests are men of authority. And church has hierarchies, right? So like in Catholicism, especially Roman Catholics, right, you have like your priest, but then they answer to a bishop, who then answers to a cardinal, who then answers to the pope, right? So on and so forth. And so my mom was also an organizer in her own right. It was early 90s, and my brother, right, being the gangbanger that he was, we had a drive-by at our house. And so my mom was like a staunch organizer around gang violence, right, and drugs, and cleaning up our neighborhoods, very early 90s. And a house for that organizing, as it tends to be in poor parts of town, are the churches. Right? Because historically, right, it was a segregated part of town, the only people that were able to help, the only institutions that would go to the segregated part of towns were the churches. And so that's where you would find food and relief often. And during the civil rights movement, it's where you found organizing space. That really didn't change in the 90s, right? And so my mom would be organizing at a church, right, out of St. Catherine's, and doing her thing, and people would get together and start to like form these coalitions by neighborhoods, and we would start to like, you know, get new, like playground equipment. And across the street from our house, they built like a youth center, right? All of these things that they fought for. And I remember this one time the bishop came down and they were having a meeting. My mom was asking them for money. I don't even remember for what. I think it was for a trip or something. And the bishop was like, no, you guys got it. You guys have been doing some good work. I think this is good. This will be good growth for you to figure it out. And you all do it. And I remember mom looked at him and was like, well, that's easy for you to say in that nice car that you rolled up in and your nice Rolex watch that you have. You know, we don't have these things. And then she like laid into him. And and all the men around the table were very like, Miss Latios, if you can please calm down. Which then really pissed her off. So she got up and she just left, right? And I was just a kid, so I like left with her. But it was the first time where I was like, oh, we can't question these people. They don't always know what they're talking about. And that sticks with me because as I do my homework about the role that religious institutions often play in relationship to local communities, there is this weird thing around charity, which I used to love, but I find sickening now. Right? Because it's like charity without a conversation of systemic problems is actually just maintaining this power relationship of like, oh, poor people, let us help you. And us helping you makes us feel better and makes us closer to God, but doesn't actually solve why you needed help in the first place. Ever. And so that makes you feel good and makes this hierarchy feel good, but doesn't actually solve any of the question of what's going wrong. And if what's going wrong is things like racism and patriarchy, and we're not talking about it in the church, and just talking about how we're helping the outcomes or the symptoms of this, that's a problem. And of course, if that's the only thing that you care about, of course you're not going to be caring about investing in the different organizing models. Of course you're not going to care about some of these other things that local communities are going to be asking of your institution, whether you're a church or a big nonprofit, if you're disconnected, if you're not in community with them. And I just find, there's a lot of history institutionally. There's narratives within the church, but then there's a narrative of what is the relationship of that church and the state. And those things are real, right? St. Catherine's and the Catholic Church here has a relationship with this state. They get money to do the charity work that they do. And that money is tied to not asking questions a lot of times. And so if we're not gonna have those conversations in here, then hey, I find you problematic. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Also for indigeneity, right? Someone who is seeking those types of roots within myself as well. I mean, those narratives with indigenous populations in Western religions are worth looking at. Everyone who identifies as some kind of Christian of any type and lives in the Americas should be really doing their homework about what that relationship was historically between that institutional church and those local populations that live here. And that's been informative as well, because I feel like people don't do that work inside the church.
So I know you're Mexican, right?
Mm-hmm.
Has like being Mexican or Hispanic, has it ever affected your, like, isolated you from participating in something or like a job interview or something like that? Or like have people ever treated you different because you're Hispanic?
Yes, to a lot of those things. It depends on where. So maybe this is also why I'm an organizer, right? I think so. The first time that being Hispanic meant something, being Mexican meant something that was a potential negative, was actually from a white teacher, right? So I would go to school, a bunch of brown kids, and we had a white teacher. And it was like, did you know that Mexican, right? Like, this is how many people, this is the population, and like maybe 4 of you are gonna go to college. And there was this whole narrative of like, apparently Mexicans don't go to school very much, and we don't go to college. And I remember, because I went to high school, I graduated from Marcos de Niza, and so from that teacher, then I went to school still, and then had a white counselor to talk to me about going to college. And that white counselor was also like, well, maybe you were looking at trade schools, right? Because apparently Mexicans are like better suited to be mechanics, or to work in like rebar or sheet metal or construction, because those were the career paths that were kept. And there's nothing wrong with those things. It's just I went in there saying, how do I get to college? And that was the answer. And it was really clear to me why that was the answer. Now that being said, you know, being Mexican has been really helpful in the organizing space, right? Because a lot of times, as a community organizer, that's where a lot of the fight is, because we're a border state. And so in that world and that sector, which again I've been in, and a lot of people are community organizers, but I have been one, have had the privilege to be one for 15 years now. And so, you know, that fight is oftentimes led by organizations